Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to Soma in Retrospective. So it's been a little while since I played this game, and I honestly had to take a good amount of time to digest and think about what I wanted to say about it and how I wanted to go about doing this, but yeah, we finally gotten there. So Soma is, of course, going to be compared a lot to games like Amnesia and Outlast, because I feel like those are the sort of baseline ones that you kind of go to if you want to talk about a horror game in this genre and in this style. First of all, we're going to jump right into the appearance of it, and that's mostly because I don't think it's a super important element to this game in particular, or any game really, but this one in particular. But despite saying that, it is a really nice looking game, more so than the other Amnesia games. I think that it's sort of got a very interesting aesthetic, it's got a very good look to it, and a lot of the things like the water outside really just spoke to me as being amazingly put together compositions and scenes and appearances. Very visually impressive in its own sort of way. Now, going from the just graphical fidelity of it and the look of it and stuff like that, and to talking a little bit more about the aesthetic of it, the game still holds a fairly creepy atmosphere that is definitely something you see in the Amnesia games, but at the same time it definitely feels very different. It feels distinct from them in a way that I'm not sure is necessarily good, and that's mostly just because I think that it's a little bit less scary than Amnesia was. I think that Amnesia was a scarier game in that it had a slightly better aesthetic, and part of the reason that I feel this way is because a lot of what this game does and has, like if we look at the screen right now, you actually see a lot of the color blue. In fact, it's because it's a very futuristic color, I think. I think that that's the main reason that you tend to see a lot of this. If you've got sort of this alien here, it's got these bright blue lights. It's very, very bright. It's got a lot of light in this game compared to most horror games. And this doesn't ruin the aesthetic for me, but it does make it feel less scary. It makes it look very futuristic, though, so I think that that's sort of the thing that they had to do at the same time, because, you know, I think blue is a very futuristic color. That's just the way that I sort of feel about that. I think that's also why they picked it, and I think that that's sort of the aesthetic that they, again, went for, and I think that they've done a fairly good job of it. So it was striking that balance between fear and sort of a futuristic man-made look, and they've kind of come into a fusion of it that I think works, but isn't as scary as the sort of raw red aesthetic of Amnesia. You can see that there's a lot of things in this game that just don't look particularly scary. So this would be an example, I think, of someone that's not particularly scary looking, but he isn't actually supposed to be, so that's perfectly fine. So, you know, there's a lot of moments in this game that are kind of like that are not really scary per se. And I think that isn't really... It's not a problem, I think. It doesn't have to be as scary as the other ones. It just is... You know, it'd be kind of nice in some ways, I think, if it was as scary as Amnesia, but it has other elements that I'll get into a little bit later. So moving on from there into sound. This game has got what it needs for a soundtrack. Talking about that one first. It doesn't have a very obtrusive soundtrack. Like, the soundtrack comes in during certain events, it crescendos a little bit, it alerts you that something's happening, but it isn't really ever at the forefront of the game. It doesn't make you feel as though it is the focus of anything. It doesn't make you feel as though what you're listening to is supposed to be the center of attention. It doesn't draw from the tension of the game itself. And that's sort of what you need in a horror game. You need the balance of the music to be there, but you never want it to be something the player is paying attention to. Because in a game like a horror game, the idea of verisimilitude is pretty much everything. Like, if you can immerse yourself in the world, you are going to be a lot more scared than if you're in a situation where, you know, it's definitely a game. You can tell yourself it's just a game, and it's easy to believe that. And in real life, when you're in a situation that's tense and scary and stuff like that, music doesn't just miraculously show up out of nowhere, so the less you notice it, the better. It can add to the atmosphere and it can add to the mood, but it can never be at the forefront. And Amnesia's music does that. Because of that, at the same time, it's not a remarkable soundtrack. I don't have any particular sounds or scores that I liked in it. There's nothing that I would ever bother listening to on its own right. That's just not something I would ever bother doing. But at the same time, that's not really what we're here for. That's not what we're looking for from this game. So, that's perfectly acceptable. Moving on from the soundtrack, the voice acting in this game, for example, of this annoying robot. Hold on 1 minute here. We're going to talk about voice acting, so I guess we'll talk to this robot and let you listen to him for a little bit here.
What are you?
Are you blind? It's me. Carl. Carl Semke. Wrangler? Any of this sound familiar to you?
No, actually.
Well, thanks for being so helpful. It's not like I'm knocked out on the floor or anything.
Are you human?
Shit, did my body give it away? I try hard staying a mystery. Yeah, I'm human. Are you?
My name is Simon. Do you know anything about this place?
Oh, you knew. That makes us slightly less weird. Look, I'm obviously hurt. If you see anyone else around, just tell them where I am.
Okay, so the voice acting in this game is actually something that I find is really quite strong. And I've actually liked the voice acting that they've done in pretty much every game they've done. Even Penumbra, I liked the voice acting with that annoying Maurice fellow. And, that was pretty good.
I'm really hurt.
I'm sorry. I think I pulled the wrong lever.
Oh, don't sweat it. Just get me a doctor.
Yeah, like, Simon, he goes through the emotional ranges pretty well. You can usually tell how he feels just from the way his voice acting goes, so I think they did a really great job as far as that goes. Catherine, I think, is a little bit more flat until she gets really stressed or starts freaking out a little bit in that sense, but, that's their characters, I think, and I think that they do a pretty good job of making sure that these individual characters all sort of feel different and have different sort of tones to them, different ways of thinking and believing and so on and so forth, that I think really worked out quite well as far as that voice acting goes, which, is a good thing. You want that from your voice acting. You want it to be immersive. You want it to be believable and the characters to be believable and for it to enhance those characters. So that, I think, was one of their big sort of triumphs in this. It wasn't necessarily amazing or anything like that, but they did a very solid performance. I think it was probably the best that they've done so far in an Amnesia game. Of course, even though it's not an Amnesia game, but you know what I mean. So yeah, definite kudos to that. And the sound effects in the game, the atmospheric sounds, the weird dripping sounds that you get from this stuff, the crackling, the strange sounds that the enemies make, that static that you get, all of that's actually quite well done as well. I do like the way that they've done that. So, the sound effects in this game are where they need to be, although, again, the music, not fantastic, does what it needs to do. There are some games actually out there, though, that do have a mix of a really good soundtrack that does stay in the background and adds to the atmosphere. I'm thinking of Silent Hill's soundtrack. Silent Hill has one of my favorite video game soundtracks, actually, even though it doesn't take away from the gameplay itself. I think that that's actually quite well done. Even the newer ones in the games that I don't like as much, they've always had really good soundtracks to me. So, it could have been better, but at the same time, I have absolutely no complaints about it, and most people aren't going to notice that sort of thing anyway. So moving on from there, let's talk a little bit about the characters. Since we were talking about the characters' voice actors, why don't we talk about the characters now? And really, there is just sort of not a whole lot that I can complain about with that either. I mean, one of the things that I've always said is severely important, like the most important thing in a horror game, is believing that you're in this place. And part of that is understanding why your character is actually in a place. So if I'm playing a game where I don't believe that the character would actually stay around there, wouldn't actually stick around there, then I wouldn't believe that I'm playing that character. I wouldn't find the character believable. And this game does a fantastic actually overkill job of saying why Simon Jarrett is here. And to the point where I actually almost think that, they could have really scaled it back a little bit. For most people, there's a motivation to be in a place like this. There's a, they've got a reason, they have a reason to want to be here. In his case, it's Earth is a nuclear apocalypse. He's a robot that's stuck under the sea, and there's nothing else he can do about being here. And, he absolutely cannot do anything other than be here with the monsters, with the crazy people, with Catherine later. But, all of that sort of goes to a good length of at least describing why he's here, why he's decided to show up in this place, even though it's infested with monsters who cause him to go horribly scrambled and, are just awful, and so on and so forth. So that's a really important element to these games. I don't like the way that they did it necessarily. I think it makes sense for the story, but I think it was a little bit overkill. Although, on the other hand, they probably weren't doing that simply for that purpose, so for that reason I can't really fault them for it. They did a good job with that element of the character and that part of the story. Besides that, I actually really like the characters of this game, especially, the main characters, and that's Catherine and Simon, of course. And Munchie as well. He feels really like a very sympathetic character, even though he barely appears in it. He's someone who legitimately is trying to help you out there. And he's so briefly in it, but you get quite a good idea of his motivations and what he is after and what he believes in, what he's trying to do, and the fact that he's helping. All these characters feel like they've got very real beliefs and motivations. A lot of them are trying to do the right thing, and they just don't necessarily know what that is or why they believe what they believe, or so on and so forth. It's a lot more complex than that, and it should be. And, Simon, great character. Catherine, great character. I just really like the way they've done pretty much everybody in this, including the bit characters. I think even, this robot over here, Carl Sumpkin, he was a pretty interesting little interjection to reveal sort of that idea that maybe these things think that they're humans. Just really sort of quickly demonstrate that idea. And the other characters as well, as you go further in, the ones that talk more about the AI, the ones that talk about, saving the Ark instead of launching it into space, and so on and so forth. Some of them felt a little bit kind of wonky, but all in all, I think the characterization in this game is pretty solid. The monsters range from really kind of not that scary, not that intimidating, to really, really quite frightening. This one wasn't too bad for me. It looked a little bit too mechanical and too blue, ironically, of all things. Blue really does feel like a soothing color to me, but this one felt like it wasn't that intimidating to me. It wasn't that scary. Whereas the one in the curry felt so alien, and so, it had that sort of element of being a little bit human, without being human, that it definitely had an impact. I feel like it was much stronger than the other monsters in this game. And I think that, it would be nice if they had more of those sorts of encounters. But, such is life sometimes. You get the ones that you get, and some of them are scary and some of them aren't. I cannot see a damn thing right now, but that's sort of the point, I think, of this section. In any event, that's sort of my discussion about the characters. Let's talk a little bit about the story. Now, the story in horror games is always going to come down to sort of that element of not knowing something. There's always that element of sort of mystery, and then discovery, and not wanting to necessarily discover anything. You're too scared to move forward kind of discovery. Resident Evil is kind of just you're scared of going around that corner because maybe there's something horrible there and it's going to kill you. In this one, you've got the sort of mystery of what's going on here. And it doesn't just delve into that, though. This game is interesting because it delves into deeper questions that are kind of unrelated to the ideas going on. It's a game that delves into sort of more philosophical ideas rather than staying focused heavily on the horror elements. And this works for and against it to a certain degree, because this game really does have that sort of element of questioning humanity, questioning what's, human. When are you no longer human? and asking the ramifications, the ethics of that, which I think is incredibly interesting. I think this is something that we're going to have to, look more into in the future. So I think that they did a very good job of presenting the question to us, presenting the arguments around it, and not giving us an answer. Which I think was a really good move on their part. I like the way that they handled that, and the way that that's done. So I think that that element of the story is really good. There is, of course, the Site Alpha storyline and AI and all of that other stuff that is the horror element of it, but it's not necessarily what I think was the main focus of the game, because they keep talking more about the arc rather than the AI, the malevolent thing from Site Alpha. And I think that that was definitely an interesting choice on their part. I think that it really made for a very compelling and interesting story that kept me wondering what was going to happen. And even though the ending wasn't scary, it felt satisfactory. There was a different kind of dread at the very, very end there, when you're literally launching the Ark into space and you see yourself staying back in that chair, and you've got a copy of Simon Jarrett that is literally all alone forever. I mean, he's going to just either be there or he's going to die alone. The last sort of being on Earth, in a certain sense. But, he has no hope there. He has no one. He's completely alone without Catherine. So, there's a sort of existential dread that you feel at that moment, because I think that that moment would be scarier to me than anything that a monster could do to me. Like, I would be more afraid of that happening to me than any monster tearing me apart. Like, I would much rather just have a monster come along, tear me to pieces, and that would be that. That would be vastly better than an infinite amount of time as sort of a robot strapped to the bottom of the sea with nothing to talk to, nothing to do. Like, that kind of gives a perspective to a different type of dread, which I think is interesting in and of its own right. But at the same time, the ending wasn't scary. And this is something I've said before, is that no horror game has a frightening ending. A horror game can have an ending that's intense, but it will rarely be the most frightening part of the game. And if they just sort of let it end at a certain point, then, you're probably going to not really like that ending. I don't think I've ever played a game that I did like the ending. So that element of the story felt a little bit weak, but other than that, the story about retrieving the Ark, getting it to where it needed to go, I thought that was all quite fantastic. I thought that was all very well written, and the sort of content that they were putting into it I thought was very compelling. Now, if you're not the sort of person who finds those sort of philosophical debates interesting, then this game could still actually be for you. While it's a little bit less scary than Amnesia and sorry about that, Fraps crashed, which was a little bit odd. But yeah, as I was saying, this game is, not as scary as Amnesia or Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs, both of which I thought were, in a direct sense, a little bit more scary, but it does have a deeper story, and I think it's one that was worth listening to. So even though it wasn't as scary, it is still scary, it is still an interesting, and it is still a good game. So I would still recommend it if you liked Amnesia and you liked Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs. And even if you didn't like A Machine for Pigs, this one falls a little bit closer to the spectrum of what you would expect from the first Amnesia game. I think that, if you didn't like A Machine for Pigs, you'd still have a chance of liking this one, because it falls somewhat in between in its emphasis of sort of gameplay. There are definitely more chase scenes, there's definitely more evading monsters, there's definitely more puzzle solving in this game, and little mini-game sort of things that you have to sort of get through to play this game, as opposed to A Machine for Pigs. But no, if you don't really care about those things anyway, like I don't really care that those are in a game or not, they feel kind of meh to me, then, this game's probably going to be a little bit better to you, as long as you also prefer the sort of dialogue. There's a lot more dialogue to this game, because you're less alone. You've got your sort of pocket thing that comes and goes from time to time, leaving you incomplete. It's something that Wow, I didn't get that the first time through this game. That was amazing. Okay, but yeah, no, you know, I never thought that the actual little puzzles or stuff like that really mattered in these games, in these horror games. They're just not that important. So I definitely feel like you should give this one a shot if you liked the other Amnesia games, or like that style of horror game. So to wrap it all up, I think that this definitely is a game worth checking out if you happen to be someone who likes Amnesia type games, and you know who you are. You know if you've played those sorts of games, if you like that kind of game. And if you haven't really played one of those sorts of games, I don't know if I would say that you should start with this one, honestly. I might start with this one if you're trying to ease yourself into the horror element. But this one definitely is probably the most complex of the games. And you probably want to sort of get used to the mechanics of these sort of games and the ideas behind them. Get used to the way that they play before you sort of dive into this one, if you want to enjoy the story a little bit better. So,
Hey,
anyway,
there?
I hope you found this
Found the dome
enjoyable, and of
ceiling.
course, as always, I hope to see you all next
Oh,
time.
that's better. Simon, was it?
Jared, Simon Jared.
Hi, Simon. I'm Catherine. Have you figured out what's going on yet?
Me? I was hoping you'd have some answers.
I probably have some. What do you want to know?
Where to even begin? I mean, what is this place? How did I get here? And why do the robots talk like they're people?
Well, you're at Upsilon, clearly. Have you never been there before? Where did you work?
The Grimoire in Toronto. Is that really important?
No, I mean, where did you work at Pezos 2?
I don't know what that is.
That's unexpected. Did you come directly from Toronto?
Yeah, I did. And it was very unexpected.
Have you seen any people? Like staff or field technicians?
Only robots, crazy ones.
This is all so strange.
You're telling me. What was that? Whoa!
What's going on?
I think this place is about to collapse. What do I do?
Simon, come to Lambda.
How do I get there?
There are shuttle trains connecting all the sites. Find one and come here. I'll wait for you.
Shit! Where should I? Oh, fuck! What the hell? How is this possible?